Hey, friends, welcome to another math lesson with Mrs. Matson. Although today might not feel like a math lesson, it might feel more like a language arts vocabulary lesson. Because the objective of today is to name all the different parts of an expression. So you're going to learn the word term, coefficient, constant, variable, product, and factor. It's going to be like low key on the math today. So let's get started. Here is our vocabulary page for the day. This is an algebraic expression. I've taught you that an expression is like a math sentence. Well, this is a special type of math sentence that's an algebraic expression. All that means is that there are variables. There are letters that we see in the expression, making it an algebraic expression. So let's talk about each parts of this algebraic expression. The first thing that we're going to talk about is this part right here. These are called terms. Now, a term is, I'm going to have you label it as everything between a plus and minus sign. So the way that I figure out a term is I begin underlining, and then once I hit a plus sign, I stop. And that is my first term. Then I begin again, and I underline until I get to, oh, there's a subtraction, I'm done. There is my next term. And I underline again till I get to the end. So this expression has 3 terms. Okay, that's a term. We'll practice all of these. The next thing we're going to label are the 3, the 4, and this invisible 1 right here. Those are called coefficients. Coefficient. A coefficient is the number in front of a variable. And you might be like, well, Mrs. Matson, I agree that there is a 3 in front of the x, and there's definitely a 4 in front of the y, but there's nothing in front of the x. Well, I'm going to teach you some invisible math. Every variable has a number in front of it, and if you cannot see it, then it's just the number 1. It's like saying this. You could say that is 1x, but what would you call that? Wouldn't you just call that 1x as well? How many x's are right there? Well, there is 1x. And of course, mathematicians like to be lazy, so instead of just putting the 1 and the x, we're just like, well, if there's only one of them, then we're just going to say x. Okay, which means that this is actually saying there are 3 x's, and there are 4 y's, and there is 1 x. So coefficients are the numbers in front of the variable. Let's talk about what that variable is. So the variables, if you'll write that, they are the letters. The x, y, and the x. Last lesson when we specifically talked about how a variable just stands for an unknown number. We don't yet know what it is. Unknown number or unknown numbers. So a variable is a letter. Okay, a letter, you could just stop it right there, or you could say an unknown value. It represents a value, represents a number. Just don't know what that number is. This last one, will you label a constant? The 14 is the negative 14, I should say, is a constant. A constant is, let me move myself so there's room, a number by itself. And you see how this 14 does not have anything behind it. There is no variable behind it. It's just a number by itself. That is a constant. All right, factors. Factors are numbers that are times together, or things that are times together. Things that are times together. Things that are, I'd say numbers, but in this case we've got numbers and variables being times together, so I'll just be really formal and official and say things. Things that are times or multiplied might sound better. Times or multiplied together. So in this case, the 3 and the x are factors. They are being multiplied together. The 4 and the y are factors. They are also being multiplied together. Don't worry, we'll practice all of those. Let's go back and focus on terms. Like we talked about, terms are the part of an expression that are being added or subtracted together. So we're going to practice. We're going to underline. Once we get to a plus, we're going to stop, and that is one term. So let me give you an example. Here's a x squared. Oh, there's a plus. We're going to stop. That is one term. Now we're going to start underlining under the plus, and we're going to stop before we get to the negative. I can do that very well because I'm not looking at it. Okay, so there's another term. Then there's a plus, so we're going to stop there, and there's a end of it. So this has 4 terms. This next one, we're going to begin and underline, stop, there's a subtraction sign. Begin again, stop, there's another subtraction sign. This one has 3 terms. And this last one, we're going to stop right there. There's a minus, there's a plus. That one also has 4 terms. So those are some ways of finding out the terms. Now, if there was a division sign in any of that, we would keep underlining it because the division is not a plus or a minus. We only stop. The term doesn't end until we hit a plus or a minus. Let's talk about constants. Constants are those terms that have no variables. So if you have a constant, then it can either be a positive number or a negative number, depending on if it's a plus or a minus in front of it. If we look, if we divide these into terms again, we can see that there is one term that does not have a variable. That term, it looks like it's a plus 4, but we could also call it a positive 4. Because if you're going to add 4, it's going to be a positive 4, right? So the constant here is a positive 4. Now, if we look at this one, there's a term that has no constant because there's a variable in each of those terms. Let's try this last one. There's a term. There is one term that does not have a variable. So the constant in that term is plus 3. It says circle the constants if they exist. So there are the 2 constants in those examples. And coefficients. I like to kind of think that coefficients and variables are like boyfriend, girlfriend, kind of like, because anytime you have a variable, you're going to have a constant with it. If a term has a variable, then the number in front of it is the coefficient. Each coefficient takes a sign in front of it, so it might be a positive number or a negative number. So here we go. We are going to, it doesn't show us, we're going to highlight each coefficient. So you can just underline it or highlight it. And here we have a variable, but it's not what we're looking for. There's a variable. Maybe I'll look at these variables first, because every time there's a variable, there's going to be a coefficient in front of it. Okay. And remember what I said, if it's not there, then it's an invisible 1. So this coefficient is 1, this coefficient is positive 2, and this coefficient is negative 5. Mrs. Madsen, that's not negative 5, that's a minus 5x. You're definitely right, but a minus 5 is going to put us in the negatives, so it's basically going to put us down to negative 5. Okay, 4 is not a coefficient, because it does not have a variable with it. Let's look at some more. Here's some more variables. Okay, so that means that the coefficients are in front of it. There's a 5, a negative 4, and a negative nothing, aka negative 1. So the coefficients here are 5, negative 4, and negative 1. Here's some variables here. It's like anytime you have a variable, you're going to have that, maybe it's not like a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. Maybe the coefficients are just like the nagging little brother or sister that always follows the older brother around. I don't know, whatever you have to do to make you remember that a coefficient is always with a variable, then do it. I'm all for that. All right, so in front of these variables, we have a 4. In front of this coefficient, we have a -2. And in this coefficient, we have a positive nothing, which is going to be a positive 1, right? So the coefficients are 4, -2, and positive 1. Or like we can just do 1, right? That 3 is not a coefficient because there's no variable behind it, correct? All right, so we're going to change. I want to give you a little background, kind of go back a step. We are only talking about expressions in this chapter, so I want to tell you what an expression is. Let me give you an example of an expression. 4x squared plus 2y minus 4. That is an expression. Now, to describe and to help you see the difference between an expression and equation, I'm going to write an equation. You can tell me the difference. The only difference between an equation and expression is an equation has an equal sign as well as an answer. And here's an inequality. An inequality doesn't tell you if something is equal to something, but it will tell you if it's greater than or less than or greater than and equal to or less than equal to. We'll get to these next chapter, but it's basically an inequality has a greater than or less than symbol. So this chapter is expression. Next chapter we'll get into equations and inequalities. I wanted you to see an example of the differences of those things. Okay, let's go on to a little bit of a practice before we're done. How many terms? Well, there's a plus, so I'm going to stop. There's a minus, so I'm going to stop, and I'm going to go to the end. There are 3 terms. What are the variables? Variables are letters. There's a variable, and there's a variable. So the variables here are c and x squared. What are the constants? Guess what? There is a positive 2 all by itself. And the coefficients, what's in front of the variables? A 7 and a -5. 7, -5. What are the factors? What's being times together? Well, 7 and c are being times together. Remember I tell you that a variable and a coefficient are always being times together. And then we have a -5 and an x squared that are also being times together. How many terms are in this example? Well, we've got, oh, plus, stop right there. There's another plus, I'm going to start right there. There's another plus, we're going to stop right there. So there are 4 terms. And if I look at each term, those are being times, those are being times, those are being times, those are being times. Every term has 2 factors. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. There's always 2 things being times together. And if you times something together, those are factors. How many terms are in here? Well, there's a plus, so I'm going to stop. There are 2 terms. Ooh, look at this. Those are all being times together. So if I look at one term, I see 2 is a factor because it's being times by A is a factor because it's being times by B. So there are 3 factors in each of those terms because it's same here too. 1, 2, 3. 3 things that are being times together. This last example, how could you describe 2 times the sum of 8 and 7? Well, you could say it's a product, right? Because it is being timesed. And you could say it's a product of 2 factors because there's 2 things that are being times together. If we just wanted to look at the 8 plus 7, we could kind of say, because it's in parentheses, we could kind of call it a single entity. That's one thing. But we could also say, because it's a plus, we could say it's a sum of 2 terms, right? Because this could be a term and this could be a term because they're separated by a plus or a minus. So if you're asked to describe those 2 things, then you could describe it either way and you would be correct. It's one term, one thing, one entity, but it's also the sum. There's also 2 terms there. I don't think you'll see it in 6th grade. You might, and now you know how to solve it. Now you know what to say. All right, can you name all of these parts of an expression? Term, coefficient, constant, variable, product, and factors. Let's see. How would you describe this expression? Would you say 4x plus 37 is the product of 2 terms, the difference of 2 terms, the quotient of 2 terms, or the sum of 2 terms? Going back, it is the sum, right? There are two terms right there, and they're being added together. So the sum of two terms. How many terms are in this expression? I may be trying to trick you on this. There are 1, 2. Did you go all the way past the division until you got to the addition? 3 and 4. There are 4 terms. All right, work on those. Figure out little things that help you remember the difference between a coefficient and a constant and a variable. Once you got them down, the practice will help. Then show me your skills in the mastery check. See ya.